When I was a kid, I knew I wanted to be in the music industry in some way, and I spent a lot of time practicing as much as I could and rehearsing and learning new things and doing everything within my power to improve my skills. After probably a decade of this Rocky-like montage of random bands and rehearsals and doing different things and all of this, I felt I was finally ready, and I put everything together and said, I have a plan. I am going to move to Nashville and I'm going to survive off nothing but guitar strings and banana chips. And this may come as a shock, but that plan really didn't work out. Good evening, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Wine 30, the show with real talk and really good wine. And in this episode, I'm finishing off the remainder of a bottle of Jim Beam, the official whiskey of they didn't have anything else, and if I ever smell another bottle of SoCo, I might explode. In today's video, we're here to talk about going full-time in the music industry, and this is a question I get every so often, and I've been getting a lot more of lately. With a lot of us being stuck at home, and I think with all the time we've had in our hands, we've all had this period of self-reflection to look back and think about if we're happy with where we are and the way we're living our lives, and I hope that this whole thing turns out to be a growing experience for everyone. And I think part of this is just the idea of examining where am I at and am I happy with it? And if I'm not, what can I do to change that? And I think this is really what has caused this question of how do I go full-time in the music industry to crop up to be a more common thing, because maybe a lot of people just aren't super stoked on what they're doing and want to make a change. In this video, I wanted to go over 6 different kind of bullet point categories that are based largely on advice I wish I could have given myself even only a handful of years ago. If you've watched this channel for the rough length of its existence, you've actually seen my journey from professional hobbyist to professional person doing this full time unfold. And a lot of what I've learned has been both in the recent past and also just throughout my journey learning to do stuff good. And I think that a lot of this is probably helpful stuff to consider, because even only a handful of years ago, I just didn't really have a good understanding of what it would take and what I needed to know to get to where I am today. And I wanted to just share as much of this knowledge as I could in one video with you guys. Most of these topics could really be their own video, and I'm sure I could discuss each of these at quite a bit of length, and I just wanted to condense this into one comprehensive video as best I could, because I think there's kind of a weird lack of transparency about this part of the industry, and I think it's due to the fact that a lot of people want to play up their success and build up things in a way that makes them look more established than they really are. And I think this stems from how we live our lives now with social media. We only show the good parts and the successes. We don't really talk about all the other stuff it took to get there. So I wanted to just kind of spill all this out in a way that just kind of puts it all on the table and hopefully gives you guys just some information that is hopefully valuable and helps you take some steps in your own life. If you also work in the industry professionally or semi-professionally and you maybe have some other advice I forget in this video, or just some other tips or insight, or maybe just want to expand on something I bring up, feel free to leave that down in the comments below. That's one of the things I really like about the community of this channel, is you guys help each other out a lot, and I think that's really, really awesome. Before we dive into it, as always, I think it's important to bring up a couple important footnotes that I think need to be just said right off the bat before we dive into the real meat and potatoes of this whole thing. Point number 1 being that if people shame you or give you flack about having a day job and that's wrong or whatever, that is a gigantic load of bullshit, and do not believe that whatsoever. There is absolutely nothing wrong with having something to pay the bills. Otherwise, you're just gonna run out of money and be broke and not be able to do anything. So I've seen that happen, and it really frustrates me, and I've been in that position where people have, you know, shit on me for having a day job, and I think it's really stupid. So if that's something that's stressing you out, let me tell you right now, just completely tune it out. It's just not relevant. Point number 2, I think, is really worth bringing up here early on in this video, is that everyone's story is different, and that's something you really have to keep in mind. The length of time that things take and the steps that are taken to get there are really irrelevant to you specifically. I could lay out every single step and thing that happened to take me from where I was to where I am now, and there's really very little chance that you could just follow that as a step-by-step guide and replicate that, because it was a combination of just doing certain things, being in the right place at the right time, and a lot of just pure dumb luck. So you just have to learn to embrace the journey that you're on. It might take a while, it might be very fast. There's a lot of weird things that happen, and you might end up in a completely different position than you would have ever expected. One final thing I think is important to bring up is that what you define success as is relative. So that's just something important to keep in mind, that, maybe be a bit more fluid in what you want to achieve or what you would take as becoming successful to mean. It's not usually something you would expect, and it might end up being something entirely different. So just some general life advice. With all that out of the way, let's pour ourselves a drink. I've got the last of this here and get into point number 1. The first category I wanted to talk about is money. And I think this is probably the most important question and the most asked question. And this is something that every other video seems to save for the end. And I'm just going to get it out here in the open because it's a pretty broad question. I want to start off by saying that making a living solely off music alone is very, very hard to do. I actually only know one person that does this, and he doesn't really make that much money and lives in kind of a dumpy apartment and survives off like Hot Pockets and things like that. And he's honestly not sure if it's something he can continue to do for the rest of his life. And I think this is a very valid point. I used to do music and stuff full-time myself and had a very similar situation. I lived in a kind of crappy apartment and lived off peanut butter, and it's not something I could see myself doing for a long period of time and live the life that I wanted to live. With that being said, as a professional in the music industry, my music is one of the smaller portions of my income. I really don't earn a significant amount of money off of it. It's not nothing, but it's not anything that totally pays my bills. And YouTube is largely the same thing. I don't earn enough money off YouTube to make a living doing that. I can make, some car payments and pay most of my bills with all that kind of stuff, but it's really not the big chunk of my income. With that being said, I think it's a big question to ask yourself is how do you intend to make money if you jump into the music industry full time? And with that, I have kind of a list of things I wanted to bring up that maybe you haven't considered or maybe just need to sit down and think about. One thing to keep in mind is, do you have a savings account? If you just jump ship from a comfortable income position, how long are you going to reasonably survive if things don't work out? And if you do jump into this industry and have some work lined up, sometimes the periods between pay are pretty long. I mean, I have portions of my income that are between very large gaps of not making much of anything. I get a big check at the end, but in between I'm kind of on my own. And I think this is a very important thing to be realistic about, because you have to cover your bases when it comes to your rent payment or whatever your situation might be. You need to know how long you can keep yourself afloat if there's just not anything coming in. I think this is especially relevant given the current situation. A lot of my musician friends and producer friends are really struggling right now because this whole thing was really unexpected. And some of these people were kind of still living paycheck to paycheck. And some of them had enough in savings that they're doing okay, but it is a very difficult time, and it's things like this you have to anticipate, that, maybe there's a stretch between checks, or just in general, you might have to keep yourself afloat for a month or two. And is that something you can realistically financially do without totally ruining your life? Another big question to ask yourself is, how much money do you actually need to make? When I first jumped into doing music industry stuff full time, I took a relatively significant pay cut, but I sat down and did the math and put out how much I actually need to make, one, in order to survive, and two, in order to survive comfortably. I could have easily thrown myself into making very little and putting myself in a very tight situation, but I put out a solid number that was realistic for me to make that switch and make it worth it and live a life that wasn't just insanely ridiculous in terms of I only get to spend $1 a day on something. This also raises the question of what kind of lifestyle are you comfortable with? I know some people are very happy with very little, and I think that being able to redefine what you want in life is an important thing to be a bit flexible on. As I mentioned, I took a pretty significant pay cut at first. I made up for that and eventually make more doing what I'm doing now than I did at my kind of 9 to 5. But it is a valid question, could you take a pay cut and be happy with your life? Because that is a very big question. If you change into doing music industry stuff full time and you think your life is miserable, then it's just kind of gonna ruin the whole thing. A very big part of this is the actual transition period, and it's very, very important to ask yourself a couple of things about your employment position. Can you change jobs? How will you change jobs? And can you test the waters out a bit? In my situation, what I did is kind of slowly work my way into things, and once I saw that the income was there and it was consistent, I slowly kind of stepped back from working a 9 to 5 and went more to like a part-time thing and then to like a super part-time thing, and eventually just transitioned into doing it full time. I was very fortunate in that I had the option to do that. My job was very flexible and they were very understanding that, this is what I wanted to do. And once it became realistic, I was going to pursue that option. If you have the ability to maybe just totally jump ship because you have a bunch of money saved up or something, then that's great. But I think it is important and responsible to ask yourself how you are going to make the transition from A to B without just putting a huge burden on yourself and, again, potentially spoiling the whole experience. When it comes to actually making money, one of the most important tips I can give you guys is diversify your income. This is a mistake I made pretty early on. I kind of had a mindset of here's what I'm going to do, and I made it work, but it really wasn't super stable. It was kind of a lot of variables that I didn't really account for and couldn't really account for. And this is a big part of what I do now. I do a lot of different things, and that way I kind of have one big pot of money coming in that if one part isn't really working out that month, then the other part kind of makes up for that. So being able to diversify your whole set of things you're doing is a very important skill, and it's important to be realistic about how you can diversify your income and what avenues you can pursue to make money. When it really comes down to money, one of the biggest things to keep in mind is you have to be realistic, both in how much you're actually making, how much you can actually make, and how much you actually need to survive and make things worth doing and all that kind of stuff. Because in this industry, money is hard, and it's really hard to be super successful and make a good living at doing this kind of stuff. And financial things can just really ruin and cripple a lot of people in this industry. So you just have to be smart about it, and you really have to ask yourself the hard questions. Sometimes the numbers ultimately are not pretty. Like I said, I took a pretty big pay cut. I still every once in a while have some periods of time that are just not looking good, but as long as you're prepared for it and know how to handle your financial situation, I think you'll be okay. The second kind of broad category of stuff I wanted to talk about is strategy. This is both the things you will do to set yourself up for success and the things you will do that will allow you to continue to be successful both long-term and short-term. One of the big things I notice when people ask me these questions about switching into the music industry full-time and making a career out of it is that often they're pretty short-sighted, and I was definitely one of these people. I kind of thought maybe a couple months in advance. I didn't really think in terms of the long game of how I'm going to play things out and how I'm going to keep up that momentum. This is very important to think about because it's easy to fool yourself into a false sense of comfort when you get a little taste of success, and when that ball rolls for a little bit, you kind of build up this idea in your head of like, all right, things are really working out. I think I'm good to go here. And that's really not the case. There are periods of success. There are periods where it's a lot of hard work, and you just have to know how to navigate these things and make the ball keep rolling. One of the biggest things when it comes to the strategy is making a plan and actually sticking to it. And this is also just a piece of general life advice. I know a lot of people in my own life, and I'm sure you guys know people like this too, who have an idea and have a goal and have a plan, and they sit there planning about planning to think about planning a plan to plan a plan about planning a plan to plan the plan about planning, and they never end up doing anything. When it comes to working in the creative industry especially, sometimes you just kind of gotta go for it, and you have to actually do something. When you make that plan, you have to see it through and take steps to actually make it happen. Another big part of this is making a list of your goals. What are the things you want to accomplish? And by having that list of goals, this one gives you a set of things to aspire to. These are the things you want to accomplish, but two, it gives you a set of things to map out. How are you going to get from A to B and make these things happen? And I think it's really important to keep doing this, not only just at first, but once you've crossed off everything, and eventually I pretty much guarantee you will if you really keep after it. You got to write that next list and just keep that ball going and keep giving yourself something to go for. Another big part of this is connections and networking, and this is something I was really not prepared for because especially as like a teenager, I was an asshole. I'm still not really the biggest pile of sunshine and rainbows to be around, but I've gotten much better at being a people person. I'm not very social, but I am very good at dealing with people, and this is an incredibly valuable skill to have. And knowing not only how to network and how to make connections, but how to make those connections work is a very valuable skill that is worth learning. This is to say, if you think you are entitled to success or whatever it may be, you really have to change that mindset because it does not work at all. Let me tell you, it did not work for me, and I see other people doing it, and it's just not good. When it comes to networking and making connections, you just have to go out and do stuff, whether it's networking on social media, on SoundCloud, or whatever it might be, going to different conventions, going to industry events, going out to concerts, meeting up with other producers, collabing with other producers. There's a whole mess of ways to network and make connections, and you would be surprised at how small of a world everything is. When I kind of first started doing YouTube, it was just this thing I wanted to do kind of for fun, and one guy knew another guy who knew another guy, and so on, and eventually it all spiraled into this weird mess of this very small world. But by being good at networking and dealing with people, it allowed me to make myself successful at what I wanted to do. With that being said, you not only need a good set of interpersonal skills, but you also need a good set of business skills and how to run a business by yourself and how to kind of keep things in line and make deadlines and do project management and how to interface with businesses versus clients and how to interface with prospective businesses and prospective clients and all this kind of stuff. So, you know, it's not just this big rosy world of everyone coming up, crawling to your feet. You have to be very professional and know what makes someone professional and come across as professional. Another very big part of strategy is knowing your skills and how you can use them. One of the things I mentioned earlier is diversifying your income, and a large part of this is having different skills and different ways to utilize those same skills. Not only do I do my music and teach on YouTube and stuff, I teach for other companies. I teach companies how to teach. I do a lot of different things. I am good at video stuff and music, and I can put all this stuff together and make a lot of money in a lot of different ways. So having a set of skills and knowing how to sell those skills, how to network with people to then sell those skills to other people, it's just all part of the same puzzle that you have to be good at figuring out. Another big part of strategy is being able to sit down and ask yourself, 1, how will you find work? And 2, how will you keep that work coming in? When it comes to initially figuring it out, it's a bit of a mess. I'm not gonna lie. A lot of my early work was just kind of stuff happening in a certain way, and it came to me and I was like, okay, cool, sure. And then I just worked really hard and did a very good job, and eventually it just kind of kept going. But now a lot of it is doing things in a certain way that allow me to attract new clients and businesses to work with, and also contacting new clients and businesses to work with to offer them something. So being able to not only know how to sell yourself and keep things going, but also how to do things in such a way that it comes back to you is very important. Finally, the last kind of big thing is more the business side of things. One being, how do you curate your brand and reputation? A lot of musicians, I think, come across as very amateur and not super professional, and these are not people that companies want to work with. They want artists who are professional and established and know what they're doing, or at least look like they know what they're doing. So it's important to know how to brand yourself, how to create a brand, how to curate an image, how to keep things consistent, how to manage your reputation and make sure that, you know, things are good and in your favor. And another thing is knowing how to set up your reputation and come across as professional. Are you going to set up a website? Are you going to have, YouTube channels? Are you going to do all sorts of other things? Are you going to change your weird AOL email from high school to maybe a professional domain name business email? There's a lot of things like that you have to consider. This brings us into category number 3, which is skills and stuff about skills. And as simple as this may seem, it is very important to know how to critique yourself and analyze yourself, and also know what you don't know. The obvious question here being, what can you do? What do you do that is good? What do you do that makes you special? What do you do that maybe gives you the advantage over the other person who does something similar? And another important question is, what do you not do? Being able to really sit down and figure out your skills and different ways you can utilize them is one of the most valuable things you can spend your time doing. If you're really good at mastering, then that's an avenue you should pursue. If you're maybe really good at songwriting, maybe you could work as a ghost producer. If you are really good at sampling stuff, maybe you could get into sound design. If you are good at just being super funny and creative, maybe you can work as a content creator, which is a large part of what I do as well, is just making stuff about stuff and things. And another part is, like I said, knowing what you don't know and being able to know what your weaknesses are and how these weaknesses may represent a challenge when it comes to finding work and continuing to get work. Similar to music production in general, knowing what you don't know and what your weak spots are is a huge advantage over the other 1,000 gazillion people who want to do the same thing that you're doing. Being able to honestly critique yourself and figure out a way to either fix your weaknesses or learn more and grow, or just work around them, is very, very valuable, because that, I think, is often what separates the people who do stuff and are successful at it from the people who kind of crash and burn. As I mentioned earlier, another big thing to think about is how many different ways can you use your skills? What points of your different skill sets overlap, and how do those overlaps maybe create a new opportunity or avenue that you could go down to find work or do something new, or maybe expand on? You know, maybe there's a weird overlap that's also kind of a weakness, but then it turns out to be something really niche-y and specific that you're very, very good at. The big takeaway from this whole section is that it's important to know how to assess yourself and how to know what level you're at and how to use that level of whatever it is you're good at to your advantage. There are a lot of different people doing a lot of different things, and being able to sit down and accurately assess what makes you special and what makes you different, and therefore makes you worth hiring, is really just one of the biggest things I think that separates the doers from the I plan to do this. Category number 4 is time management, the thing we all hate the most, because believe it or not, when it comes to the music industry and creative industry, it's not all Call of Duty and Hot Pockets. You do actually have to do work and show up and do things. The most important thing to understand is, are you actually good at managing your time, and how do you know that you're good at managing your time? Funny enough, some of the work I receive is actually because people don't get things done. I've received a good amount of work from companies who are on a tight deadline, who need someone to fill in that gap because so-and-so wasn't able to get it done when they said they could get it done. Time management is an incredibly important skill in this industry because things move at a very breakneck pace, and being able to accurately say, I can get this done in this amount of time, is very, very important, because you will be held accountable. And believe it or not, you still have a boss most of the time. Even though you work for yourself and you kind of do your thing, you do report to people and you do have obligations, and you need to know how to manage your time effectively to ensure that these obligations are not only met and completed, but maybe even exceeded. That's a really, really big thing. Sometimes things in this industry are relatively open-ended. You might not have an end date. They just might want you to do a certain project, or you might have a certain thing in mind that you want to do that's just kind of up in the air. But being able to sit down and make a plan and plan things out in a way that you can plot out an end date, or at least a kind of end goal, and how you're going to get there in a reasonable amount of time, is an important thing to understand. A couple of things to think about here are, how do you plan to manage your time? Are you going to use a calendar? Are you going to use a notebook? Are you going to use something like Trello or Basecamp or Asana? These are very important tools that are a big part of your life when you're in this industry, is having a way to map things out, plot things out, have a checklist to work your way through in order to make sure that everything is accomplished. Another good thing to keep in mind is how good are you at multitasking? Often I'm working on several projects at the same time, and being able to make sure that these are all happening at the same time and being done well, and also being done in an order that makes sense in order to, one, not burn myself out, and two, make sure things are working effectively, is a pretty important skill to understand how to develop. It's a big thing that, if you're not great at multitasking, this is honestly probably not the industry for you, because there's a lot of moving parts and you have to be good at keeping track of them. Another big part of this industry that I think people maybe don't understand is being accountable, and how are you going to hold yourself accountable? Because like I said, you do have a boss a lot of the time, and sometimes you don't. And in either case, you need to know how to wake up at a reasonable hour in order to get things done, and make sure things are flowing correctly, and make sure things are done to a standard that represents you and your work, and being able to stand by the work you produce and make sure that it's quality stuff done in a reasonable amount of time. The ability to hold yourself accountable even when no one is really watching is extremely critical to, I think, long-term success. The last big point is, how do you work effectively, and how do you make sure that you're working effectively? I think a lot of people, myself included, really struggle with this, especially when you're kind of new to things. When I first really got into a lot of the work I do now, some of it was just kind of a giant hot mess of things happening, and I had to really learn how to optimize my workflow in order to make sure everything got done well, and everything got done effectively, especially when it comes to multiple projects going on at the same time. If I'm kind of like really going after one thing and neglecting another, then it just doesn't work out. You have to learn how you work, and what is it about your specific workflow that makes things successful, and then how do you implement that into your strategy to get everything done. Category number 5, I think, is something people maybe forget about, and that is motivation. And this is something I think is overlooked, and something I honestly didn't consider all that much. And the thing here being, when you do this kind of stuff for work and your income really depends on it, it takes a lot of the fun out of it. This is something I haven't really seen addressed in other videos like this, and I think is something that's especially important to talk about, is that when you do this stuff as a hobby, when you get done at work and you go home to make some tracks, it's just a way to unwind, and it's really fun, and it's that creative energy that's maybe not being used the rest of your day. But what happens when you have to use that all day, all the time, indefinitely? And I think this is something that maybe you don't think about, because it does burn you out, and it sucks a lot of the fun out of what you thought was the greatest thing ever. I think this is a thing that's fair to say for everybody. You start a new job and you're really hyped on it, and then in a couple of months or a year or two, you just absolutely hate it. And this is a very big part of this industry. I really love music. I continue to love music. And the big thing to me is that there's always been something in my personality that has driven me to do this no matter what. And I think that's the big core part of this whole thing, but it sucks a lot of the fun out of it. I have to keep using those same creative muscles all the time, and it zaps a lot of that energy out of you. And sometimes it sucks the ability for me to create music, and that's kind of my core thing, is I love making music, but sometimes after working on a lot of projects, I just don't want to do anything. I want to not look at a DAW ever again. And it's a very, big thing you have to keep in mind, is once this becomes your job, can you actually keep it up? One of the big points about motivation is, how do you intend to keep that ball rolling and keep yourself interested? You have to be able to challenge yourself in creative ways in order to make things interesting and fun. When you're doing the same thing over and over and over, it just sucks and gets boring, and then you're kind of over it. So being able to continue things, but continually keep things spicy, is just something you have to understand how to do. Is, how are you going to keep yourself engaged rather than just going through the motions and churning stuff out? Another thing I think is important to bring up when it comes to motivation is, how do you work when you have to work really long hours? I have days where I really maybe only work 4 or 5 hours, but I have other days where I'm working 10 plus hours, 14 plus hours. It's kind of ridiculous at times, honestly. And is that something you can realistically do? Are you happy to sit and work on a project for like a gazillion hours a week, whether you like it or not, because it just needs to get done? Are you happy to be the guy that can do things short term and continuously produce good stuff and keep yourself interested and keep yourself engaged in order to make the best end result that you possibly can? When it comes to this category of motivation, I have two pieces of advice that have continuously gotten me through some of the tougher periods where I have honestly questioned what I'm doing and, kind of thought about getting out of it. The big thing, I think, is never be the smartest guy in the room. When it comes to this industry, there's always something else out there and someone else doing something cool that just inspires you to do the same or do something sort of similar or do something completely different. So exposing yourself to people around you that are in this network and in this industry can really be helpful, and always just be doing something to make yourself grow. Point number 2 being always learn something new. Maybe it's not even music related. As long as you're just challenging yourself to continue to grow and try something new, try something different, that is what really just helps keep things interesting. And it's something I've always stuck by, is just trying to learn something new, trying to do something in a new way, trying to maybe learn a new approach to doing something I've done a million times, or just learning something else that's just kind of like crazy and really hard to understand. There's a lot of stuff I wish I could understand and I don't, but by exposing myself to these things and trying to understand them, it just keeps me interested and keeps me curious. And I think that's one of the big things about this industry, is just remaining inspired and just being able to give yourself a constant source of inspiration somehow is very important. Finally, this brings us to the last category of this video, which is category number 6, life and stuff. One of the big questions I think is really worth asking yourself is, where do you sit in life in terms of your obligations, and how do you intend to hold yourself up to these obligations? Whether I like it or not, every month I have bills to pay. I have a car payment to make. I have rent. I have other things, food and dog stuff and whiskey. And it's a pretty big thing to ask yourself, like an adult, how do you intend to hold yourself up to these obligations? Do you have people who depend on you? Do you live with other people? Are you married? Do you have kids? Do you intend to have kids in the future maybe? These are all really important questions to ask yourself. And when it comes to life stuff, you just have to look at things in the bigger picture. Obviously, it's really fun to be in this industry. I wouldn't change what I do for the world. I love it so much, and I'm so grateful to be where I am. But I also have to live life like a functional adult and a functional human being, and know what I need to get done at the end of the day and how I'm going to make sure that that happens. Some of the other big adult questions you have to ask yourself are, what about health insurance and things like that? What about retirement? What is the long-term plan? Do you maybe want to buy a house one day? And is this something you can realistically make enough money at to make these things happen? What are your aspirations for your life beyond just working in this industry, and how are you going to make that happen? And what about the long-term game of retiring and things like that? Because it's not like I have a retirement savings account special company matched thing. Everything I do and the position I'm in right now, I'm on my own to make sure that these things happen. And can you work and make sure things like that work out and put that kind of pressure on yourself realistically? Another big thing is the ability to assess your financial situation and maybe hire an accountant. I have an accountant, and it's a very, very worthwhile thing to help me understand how my taxes work and how things are going and all that kind of stuff. And another big thing is understanding what your debt to income looks like. If you have a lot of credit card debt or student loans or a very high mortgage payment, or maybe health issues or whatever it may be, you have to look at these things realistically and understand that these aren't things that just go away. You have to make sure that your bases are covered, and being able to assess realistically how much you're making and how much you need to make to cover your absolute basics. Very, very important question to ask yourself, because like I mentioned earlier, money and financial issues can absolutely destroy people in this industry. One of the final big points I want to bring up here is a very serious question. We're gonna get real, as if we haven't been getting real this whole episode. What sacrifices are you willing to make in order to make this happen for yourself? As I mentioned previously, I think I am one of the luckiest people in the world to be where I am. I am thankful every day that I get to do what I do, and I'm so grateful for a lot of the things and people who have helped me make this happen. And I think another big part of this is looking at it and the way I live and how I am going to live in the future. I have made some life choices that maybe people just aren't comfortable making. I don't want to get into all the specific details because everyone's story is different, but you have to ask yourself what kind of life you want to live in the broader sense of things. What do you want to do? Where do you want to be? And this, like I said, could be marriage, this could be kids, this could be I want like 12 sports cars. Maybe you want a really big house. Maybe you want to live close to your family. Maybe you want nice things. You have to be able to ask yourself, what are you willing to give up in order to make sure that these things happen in terms of your career in the industry? Because a lot of people make a lot of choices and a lot of sacrifices to make sure that they can continue doing what they're doing. This isn't to be doom and gloom and say you're going to struggle and be a starving artist. I live very comfortably. I'm not super loaded or anything ridiculous by any means. But in order to live the lifestyle I live, I have had to make certain choices in my life and forego a lot of different things that some people may find very important and may not be comfortable giving up. There are certain things that I think are just big questions you have to raise for yourself and keep a realistic eye on to make sure that you are able to do this in the long term, because jumping ship for something that is really fun and exciting and then totally burning all the bridges behind you, not a great idea. So to cap this video off, I have one final point that I think is some very good life advice as well, and that is that shit happens, just be prepared to wipe when it does. So boy, that was a long video. I'm sorry that this was a lot of ranting. This is just a video I've wanted to make for a very long time. So with that said, cheers to you for hanging out with me. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it helpful. And I hope that maybe this just really helps people out who have a lot of questions and maybe just needed to hear some of this. And I think that pretty much wraps it up. So yeah, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys again soon.